I'm very pleased to be speaking to the first four-time guest. This is Jayant Bhandari. He is a financial analyst and an investor. He advises various companies, and he runs a seminar called Capitalism and Morality, which is a kind of prominent free speech seminar that occurs mostly in Canada that has some interesting figures go to it. But most importantly, and I think most popularly, he's known as a very incisive critic and analyst of the third world compared to the first world. He has traveled to around 100 countries, so he always speaks from firsthand experience. He's lived in many of these, and he's a very interesting person. Jayant Bhandari, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Gabriel, and thanks very much for having me again.
Yes, it's my pleasure. I'll say to the audience, I'm going to ask a lot of the questions that I want to ask, building on previous episodes. So definitely go back and watch first episode 46, 77, and 84, where we talk about some of his more foundational ideas. We will talk about some of that. So you'll get something out of this conversation, but you might want to go and visit those as well. If I'm just to kind of summarize, though, for the audience, if you're still with us, Mr. Bandari talks about a lot is people of the third world, which is, in his view, basically everyone outside of the West, maybe East Asia. And these people, as Giant says, they do not approach the world from reason, and therefore they are irrational. And as a result of this difference in rationality and irrationality, an infinite chasm separates these two groups of people. And Giant's work is kind of spelling out this chasm. So I wanted to ask you this question first, Giant, which is, it seems to me when I listen to you talk that a big influence of yours is Ayn Rand, somebody who talks a lot about reason, maybe the biggest kind of proponent and philosopher of reason in the 20th century. Now, Ayn Rand doesn't talk at all about third world cultures, from what I remember, but you seem to have applied her ideas to your views pretty organically. How does her philosophy help you to see the third world as you do today?
Gabriel, I had a friend in New Delhi, and she once told me that my ideas matched very well with a novel that she had. And I thought I was someone in the closet who was trying to hide his views because my views were so different. So she eventually, and this friend of mine in New Delhi eventually brought that book for me, and that was The Fountainhead. And I started reading that book, and it was a cathartic experience for me because for the first time I realized there were views which matched with with mine. So I already had a very similar basis that Ayn Rand had, and I think the probably the reason is that she grew up in Russia. She grew up in a relatively wretched society, not as wretched as India is, but she grew up in a wretched society. And as a result, she had an understanding of what totalitarianism is, what systems lead to, what moral and rational values lead to. So she had an understanding of it, which she expanded very well. And she helped me connect a lot of my dots, my experiences.
Right, and absolutely no patience for anything outside of the rational world. Another phrase, or a phrase you like to use, is magical thinking. And this is a very important idea that connects to the third world. I'll just read the Wikipedia definition. Magical thinking, or superstitious thinking, is the belief that unrelated events are causally connected despite the absence of any plausible causal link between them, particularly as a result of supernatural effects. This is, of course, people will apply this to religion, but it can also be applied to the ways of thinking of just people in the third world, as I'm sure you would agree. And in my estimation, one of the main events in Western civilization was the end of magical thinking, where if we go to the pre-Socratic philosophers, you have, especially the first one, as we're told, is Thales, who looked at the world and said, "Look, let's not explain this in terms of gods. Gods are doing this and gods are doing that. Let's try to get a better explanation." And so he started looking at the ocean and the land, and he says, "Why are these two things different?" He came up with a theory. Okay, the whole world is made up of water, and it condenses sometimes and it separates sometimes. And this led to Western philosophy, which tries to explain things in a stronger causal way. And of course, we can see the beginnings of science in there as well. So, just your thoughts on what magical thinking is and how that is a core to understanding the third world.
So a lot of these things have a symbiotic relationship: magical thinking, irrationality, amorality, a lack of virtues, a failure to differentiate between right and wrong, excessive materialism and hedonism, savagery, barbarism. These all have symbiotic relationships, and it's very strangely, these people have a massive existential crisis. They are among the most stressed people on the planet. So if you look at the happiness index, and I know this data is not really very reliable, but some of the most unhappy places on the planet are countries in the third world. Now, if you look at the new age literature, they will say, hey, these poor people are happy despite their poverty, which is completely a lie. These people suffer from existential crisis, and the reason they suffer from existential crisis is that in their minds everything is arbitrary. They can't predict anything. They don't think there is objectivity in the universe. They don't know why what happens. They believes in fate. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have any beliefs or you should not have any faith. What I'm saying is that in their mind, the only thing that happens is this arbitrariness in how they perceive the world. They don't really have, as a result of that, as a symbiotic relationship, a concept of moral values. Now, I did not say they are immoral. They are amoral. They can't differentiate between what is moral and immoral because they don't have any objective standards. As I said, they haven't this for in their minds everything is arbitrary. And this is what magical thinking means as well. They are superstitious. They don't really understand causality in an objective sense. All their causality is about magical thinking, which means that the cat crossed the road, so now I have bad luck waiting for me. So they don't really have an objective causality in their minds, and unfortunately, they can't start building that. And you mentioned the word chasm that there is between the developed world and the third world, and you also talked about the Greek philosophers. Now, this is very interesting because the third world people, and I'm talking about people in the Indian subcontinent, people in s- Africa, or people in large section of populations in Latin America, uh, they haven't even arrived where Greek people arrived about 3 millennia back, and that is the chasm that divides the developed world from the third world, and that is why we can't patch up this chasm. This is a 3 millennia separation between the West and the rest.
One figure that I've discovered in the last few months is somebody called Joshua Blahi, otherwise known as General Butt Naked, an African guy in Liberia, and just kind of looking at his introduction on Wikipedia. So he was initiated as a high priest at the age of 11. He was part of a regime that deployed black magic rituals at the presidential palace, which helped him win the 1985 general election, or so he believed. And if we go down here, he became kind of a rebel leader, fought without clothing, and perpetuated numerous atrocities, including child sacrifice and cannibalism. And then later on, he became supposedly a pastor after receiving a vision of Jesus. So when I think of magical thinking, I think of this guy, General Butt Naked. Um, in your other videos, you have claimed that the West is essentially the only civilization, and I wonder, is that in the current terms or even historically?
Even historically, West has been the only civilization, and the only people who have been able to copy Western civilization are people in East Asia. And when I say people in East Asia, I'm talking about Japan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and increasingly China. But apart from these countries, other people have completely failed to understand or even see, Gabriel, which is very interesting. They can't even see the values of the Western civilization. When they look at the West, the only thing they see is the fruit of the Western civilization, the material output of the Western civilization. They can copy the dressing of Western civilization. They can maybe copy the language. They can copy the behaviors of Western people. Uh, and they maybe copy the low class aspect of the Western society, which is hedonism, in for themselves. And that is all they see when they look at the West. And the reason is that they don't really have the intellectual framework to see the concept of civilization in the West.
I think a lot of people, when they think of civilizations, they'll think of, let's say, the Aztecs, who had complex social systems. They developed mathematics. They had cities. They'll think of maybe the Egyptians. Think of the ancient Chinese, or the ancient Japanese, and their societies, or maybe some of the Middle Eastern dynasties before and during the time of the Bible. The Sumerians. Is the West really the only civilization? And what then do you mean by civilization?
Well, everything is in the gray area. There's nothing perfect on the planet. We are not perfect people. The Western society is not perfect. I don't think it has reached the goal of being a perfect civilization. When I say that the West is the only civilization I have known, which pretty much means that if I have a standard between 0 to 100 on civilizational spectrum, maybe the West is somewhere around 50, and maybe these Aztec people were around zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.1. And that is the difference between the civilizational values of these two societies. There's a huge, huge, huge chasm between how the Western people think and how the people in the rest, which is the third world countries, think. Now, the only exceptions I make out of the third world countries is Vietnam and Cambodia and now North Korea. These are the three countries I think have a potential to become first world countries. But other third world countries are world countries. They will stay third world countries, and they were always wretched, poor, exploitative, from your perspective, crime ridden third world countries. And when I say from your perspective, is because when you talk with criminals in the third world countries, they don't really realize that they are criminals. And people who are suffering criminalities in the third world countries don't really realize that they are victims. There's this interesting video that circulates around in social media in which a Western guy asks an African guy, "What do you think when you rape a woman?" And this guy says, "Yeah, I feel bad about it." And this goes on for a bit, and he says, "What is it about it that you feel bad?" And he says, "Hey, I might have got some disease from that woman." So he has no comprehension of the pain he inflicted on that woman, and that is what the third world is all about, Gabriel.
Tells a story of going to an African chieftain, and he asks him, what is good and what is bad? And the African chieftain says, what is good is when I kill my enemy and take his wives. What is bad is when my enemy kills me and takes my wives. So that was the kind of might makes right moral relativism, or amorality, you might say, of that. And that's fair enough about the Aztecs. When Hernan Cortez and them arrived there, what they discovered was that they had a priest class that was wearing human skin, and that they were performing sodomy, and that there was obviously cannibalism and human sacrifice. So, not exactly the pinnacle of civilization, the Aztecs. I wanted to ask you about Christianity in the third world. So, there are a lot of religious bean counters that like to note how much Christianity is spreading in Africa, or Catholics like to include all of South America in their count of the world's Catholic population. But I kind of wanted to ask you, what is Christianity in the third world? So in the West, Christianity is a set of guidelines on how to live, right? You first believe in Christ, then you follow the lifestyle tenets of Christianity as seen in the Bible, and the secondhand rules that your pastor or Catholic social teaching directs you to do, whether that's treating others as you would want to be treated, honoring your parents, tithing, resistance of the desires of the flesh, etc. But if we explore the third world, it's clear that Christianity manifests in a different way. There's a lot more emotion, right? You go to a church service in Africa, and there might be 3 hours of dancing and singing, and a lot of superstitions still remain. There are some bizarre things that happen in Central America, mixing Mary, with other gods on display. I was at a Catholic church in Central America, and they had the actual bones of a saint there. And even my Catholic friends had never seen anything like that. They thought it was pretty pretty grisly. I've been looking into recently the Lord's Resistance Army in Africa, which is quote unquote a Christian extremist organization that's been accused of human rights violations, murder, abduction, mutilation, child sex slavery, and recruitment of child soldiers. So please go into as much depth as you can. How does Christianity germinate in, and what does it mean to be a Christian for a third world person?
So there are wide ramifications of what you just asked. I told you earlier that when people of the third world look at the Western society, they don't see the civilization. They can't really copy it because they don't even see the civilization in the West. The only thing they see is this cargo cult aspects of the Western society. They think that if they get a certificate from a university, all is good for them. They become powerful and they somehow get this magical power to get work done. They copy the hedonistic and savage aspects of the low class of the Western society. Similarly, when you transplant Christianity on the third world, what you are left with is voodoo. And that is what is practiced pretty much across the board in sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent or Latin America, to a different degree, of course, because there are, of course, a lot more Europeans in Latin America than there are in African continent or in Indian subcontinent. So the problem is that imposing Christianity on these people isn't going to change them, because you have to set the foundations right first, and the foundations is the concept of truth seeking, that concept of moral values, and the concept of reason, and also the concept of honor and discipline. Unless you have this basic fabric, the basic foundational elements, nothing good of the West will work in these countries. And you can see this not just with Christianity, Gabriel. Christianity became voodoo, but you also look at what prosperity and education and democracy did in the third world. Democracy invariably turned into horrible tyrannies in the third world countries. Education hasn't really enlightened people in the third world. When the Indian government, Indian scientists send moon missions, they before sending the moon missions, they go to the temple and have elaborate rituals in the temple for success. Now, if I were a scientist, I would be going crazy. I would be getting sleepless nights, making sure all my code were right, all everything was absolutely right. I would be singularly focused on the rockets and the satellite. But somehow they can find the time to go to the temple, because in their somewhere in their minds, going to the temple to do the ritual has its value. uh, Similarly, you can impose prosperity on these people, and you realize that they get bored of that prosperity very quickly. You also see that prosperity in a lot of third world countries, if that happened, it resulted into a worsening of savagery in their societies. They went absolutely crazy. My grandmom probably understood this better than anyone else I have known. She used to say that there are some people who should be kept at the edge of starvation, because if you give them too much, they have too much time to create trouble. uh, when you when they are at the edge of starvation, they are focused and disciplined, not because that comes internally, but because that is enforced on them by the circumstances. So the ramifications of your questions are very wide and deep. Christianity becomes voodoo, Western civilization becomes Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian. Prosperity becomes just this ugly, snobby way of living, show off aspect of living. Um, and there's just simply no peace. And let me go a step further here, Gabriel. I met an Indian bureaucrat, a very senior Indian bureaucrat in Manchester when I was studying there. And he told me, he said, Jayant, I feel very lonely in the United Kingdom. And I was surprised, because I was just in awe of the peace and the the sense of security and the civilization that I saw around me there. But he wanted to run away to India. And I said, expand on what I said, what you said. And he said, Jayant, the problem is I go to the bank, my work gets done right away. I go to the post office, my work gets done right away. I don't have to chase the electricity company or the water company. But the other side of the coin is no one comes to me for favors either. Whereas in India, when he was in the office, there would be a mass of people waiting for him. He felt important. So also understand what kind of motivations these people have. They are not motivated by peace or harmony. They are motivated by sadistic aspects of life. They are motivated by hedonism. They, their desires are very base. And as you rightly said, Christianity required people to restrain on their desires of flesh. But those concepts simply don't sink into these people. And that is why, Gabriel, I can go on and on actually here, but that is why when people tell me that all you have to do is to impose Christianity on the third world and things would change, or remove Islam from the Middle East and things would improve, and I say, no, don't even touch it. I prefer Chesterton's fence, leave it the way it is, because anything you try to do to influence them from top down is going to worsen their situation rather than improve it. And that is what I think Christian missionaries of the past understood very well. They wanted to bring a bottom up change. These Swedish nuns and priests actually went to the deep inner parts of Africa to educate those people, to bring moral consciousness among those people. And my guess is at one point of time, they also realized that they had to take babies away from the parents if they did not want magical thinking, the operating system of magical thinking, to be implanted in those babies. Now, Gabriel, what I'm saying might sound very alien to you, and this is because a person who is civilized, a person who is rational or moral, has this handicap. He does not really understand properly what evil is, what irrationality is, and what magical thinking is, because for him, magical thinking is no more than Mickey Mouse comics.
And I have known people who have been in the third world and served as pastors, and they have stories of people who have been in the congregation for a long time come visit them to get prayer, receive prayer for healing, and then immediately go to their witch doctor, which really makes you think. And let me just ask you this question. Based on what you understand about Christianity, do you think that a third world person can be a Christian?
No, the answer for an average person is no, and I think Christians should actually stop spreading their religion, because you bring in all kinds of people with a very different mindset. And almost guarantee you that the person you just talked about, the person in the third world who went to the pastor for prayer, he did not really pray for spiritual gains. He went there to pray for material gains. uh, so this is what virtually always happens. Now, there is always this tail end of the curve. There's this 0.1% or 0.05% of the people who actually grasp the Christian idea. Um, but but the problem is that when you try to impose Christianity from top down, or Western ways of life from top down, you create 99.9% more problems, and you reduce problems among 0.1% people. You might awaken that 0.1% of people, but the harm done is more than the benefit you uh, give to those societies. And that is why, Gabriel, when people ask me about all the values, the good things that we now see in Hinduism, for example, or Buddhism, or even Islam, I always say that always try to understand history on how the European colonizers Christianized Islam or Christianized Hinduism, and made them aware of some of those things within the scriptures of these religions which aligned with Christian philosophy. But otherwise, as a bad clock is 100% correct twice a day, when you have hundreds of scriptures, there are all kinds of things in those, and Christians basically identified the good things among those scriptures and highlighted those things to help whatever Muslims they could Christianize in their thinking, not actually in terms of changing religion or in terms of Hindus becoming aware of some good values that Christianity has. And today, what you have is Muslims who say they believe in peace, they believe in democracy. But hey, all those concepts actually came from the Western civilization. There's nothing from what I see within Islam which talks about peace and democracy.
Well, now that we've either blown people's minds or caused them to stop listening based on these ideas that we've expounded on in the last 15 minutes, let's take a tour around the world, Jayant, because I love your perspective on different regions, different places. Of course, we should definitely start with India. The Bhopal disaster. So, for people who want to look that up, it's Bhopal. I believe you were there when it happened. Could you summarize this event and what exactly happened?
Yeah, I was there. I was in my high school when this event happened. A gas leakage took place in a Union Carbide factory, and this gas leakage led to literally thousands of people dying overnight within the next few hours. I woke up uh, from this strong, pungent smell that started irritating my eyes and lungs. Now, we were about 20 kilometers from the site. So you can imagine the kind of harm that gas did to the people, the local people. Now, here are a few things, Gabriel. This site was in an supposedly in an isolated location, but the demagogues allowed slums to appear all around it. But also, Gabriel, I have come to realize that you should not the third world people should not engage in high technology gadgets and equipment anyway. Now, my dad ran a printing press, and one day there was an accident in a printing machine. And when I went to check that machine, I realized that they had disconnected all the safety knobs and circuits in that machine. They had either separated them through an insulator or through a thread. They have done everything to disconnect the safety equipment. The same thing very likely happened in Union Carbide because Indians simply do not get the concept of safety. You watch Indian traffic and people go absolutely crazy on the road. They face a near death experience, and 15 seconds later, they are driving like crazy again. So, that is one thing. They should not have constructed these high technology stuff in that country in the first place. Uh, and this Union Carbide event happened, it killed thousands of people. But the other thing that woke me up that night was the sirens that I heard nonstop, and that was for the first time I heard sirens the way it was. And for almost 20 years, my palms would start sweating if I heard sirens. So when I lived in the Kingdom, my palms would sweat when I heard sirens. It was an involuntary action, and this was what was happening, Gabriel. Virtually all bureaucrats, the police and the army, there is an army center in Bhopal, they all ran away using the emergency vehicles. They took away all the authority, all the institutions, and they ran away from the city. There was no law and order in that city for the next few months. We were by ourselves. And there were hospitals had no concept of what to do. There was no understanding of how to treat these people. I went to the hospitals. I tried to do as much voluntary work I could, but really there was nothing I could do because I was not an expert in any of those things. There was no expert on those things. Doctors had run away. There were junior doctors telling us to give aspirin to people who were suffering, which did nothing. So after a few days, I stopped going to do my voluntary work as well. They completely abandoned it. And also, Union Carbide had a pleasure center in the heart of there's a hill in the city, and there's a pleasure center where they supplied apparently women and booze and other things to bureaucrats of the city. But that is just normal. Gabriel, when you operate in India, you have to do all these things. There is no way around corruption in that country, and I'm not going to lie about it. I live in the US, and I challenge the US government to tell me that I can't do those things in India, because no person can stay alive in India if he does not bribe and wine and dine with these bureaucrats. That's how that country works, and that's how that country will continue to work. And again, coming back to that your earlier question on Christianity, the same thing happened with the British institutions. So as Christianity became voodoo, similarly British institutions became completely perverse. They uh, they are used, not there's no checks and balances left. They are used for leveraging tribal instincts of people. So they these people had uh, over centralized the country, and then they ran away from Bhopal. So the institutions today are worse than they were earlier. And that is why I tell people, and they find it shocking actually, when I say that when Taliban kind of institutions emerge in India, it will be a better country. And that will eventually happen anyway, because this is what works with those kind of people.
What is the Indian practice of sati?
So Indian practice of sati dates back to as long as you can go. A lot of people blame it on Muslims. And again, Gabriel, I always say this thing that I have no love for Islam. But compared to Hinduism, Islam was an improvement. And that is saying a lot about how wild India was before Islamic rulers came. Sati was practiced in India, and the concept of sati was that the widow of the guy who died, the man who died, was put on the funeral pyre and burned alive. Now, those women who chose not to go through that process went through a horrendous life, including of prostitution and hunger and exploitation and uh, mostly ostracism in that society. So, sati was this concept, and you can date it back to pre Islamic arrival. When Islam came to India, it is thought that the areas that Islamic rulers ruled in India had less of that practice than the Hindu areas. Now, Hindu word itself is a British concoction. There was nothing like there's nothing like Hinduism actually. But again, we can go into details on that later. But this concept of exploitation, abuses, might is right, was always a fundamental part of India. And when Islamic rulers came, they started putting some restrictions on sati. The native people had to take approvals from the local Islamic guy before they could commit sati. Now, this went on anyway, but there is a belief that there was a reduction in sati within Islamic areas. Now, when Europeans came, the British basically said, hey, you can commit sati, but we will then hang you as well. So that is when they put a complete stop to sati. But of course, as you can imagine, Gabriel, it hasn't stopped. I hear cases of those even today, and there have been cases where which were well publicized. They are sati temples, which means that women who committed sati, they became deified in that society. And I have been to those temples. There was a temple right behind where I lived in India for many years. So um, this is how Indians think. I mean, you really have to immerse yourself in such a society to understand the cesspool that it is.
The first time I heard about sati was reading an introduction to some post colonial theorist in, I think it was the Norton Anthology of Theory. And no joke, um, I tried to find the line, I couldn't find it, but basically what was being said was, um, while the British removed the practice or tried to abolish the practice of sati, and that offered some freedom for women, it was still an imposition on the native culture. So if you can imagine that, and it's lines like that in the nonsense theory of the West that kind of helped me wake up and say, wait, what did they just say?
Yeah, this is my approach, Gabriel. I believe in Chesterton fence. If I had the authority, if I had the switch to end wearing of burqa, the black garb that Muslim women have, or if I had to end sati pratha or sati system, or if I had to end uh, female genital mutilation, if I had a switch to end those things right away, I very likely won't use them because, firstly, that will be an imposition on those people, and it will have perverse effect. It will have worse second order effect than that I cannot imagine right now. So I must first fully understand why those things came into existence before I try to amend those. Unfortunately, in today's world, we have a very superficial understanding of things. We say, hey, racism is bad, sexism is bad, this is bad, that is bad. We don't really want to go back on where those things came from and then work our ways. And you should get rid of all these things, but make sure that getting rid of one bad thing does not result into 10 new bad things. And that is all I'm talking about. And that is why Chesterton fence is so important. We should not try to impose from top down any of our values because they will have a perverse effect. And that is what you see in Afghanistan, for example. How did imposing democracy on, let's say, Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan help those people? You should have made bottom up work. And this is something that British colonizers and Christian missionaries of the past really understood well. They wanted to minimize their interference in local affairs. Always remember, the cesspool that the third world is beyond the imagination of people who grew up in a civilization. And as I like to say, people of higher IQ, of higher civilizational values, are handicapped in terms of understanding how evil, how stupid, how sadistic, how hedonistic people of the third world are.
Well, it's completely consistent with your ideas, though. I'll just say I think the leftist theory person was not saying that for the same reasons as you were. I wanted to ask you about a random question here. I think there's a Trinidadian, British-born but ultimately Indian author named V.S. Naipaul, and he wrote a book. One of his first big books was A House for Mr. Biswas. He would later go on to win the Nobel Prize. It's actually a good few Indian writers. What are your thoughts on V.S. Naipaul, and is he worth reading?
Absolutely. And, House of Bishwas tells you about how you retain your cultural values even if you have moved to the other side of the world. It's amazing that when I hear from people or when I visit these countries where there are Indian communities or Indian majority who might have been separated from India for hundreds of years, they still have the same ways of thinking and same ways of irrational behaviors. You see Guyana, you see Mauritius, you see Trinidad. V.S. Naipaul is one of my favorite authors. I have read a lot of his books, and they have helped me understand India better. So, yes, people should read his books. He's a great author. One of the good things about that India has provided. The good thing about Naipaul is that because he grew up outside India, he had a different way of looking at the country. When you are an outsider and you go to India, you have a more crispier understanding of things. For example, Gabriel, just about a week back, an American friend of mine told me, Jayant, there's no running water anywhere in India. Now, this woman had lived in India for many years, and I said, yeah, that's true. There's actually no running water anywhere in the country, even if you live in the most expensive part of India, there is actually no running water in that country. Now, this is something I did not even think about. But for a foreigner, when he goes in there, he lives there. He sees these things which I have stopped seeing anymore.
One of the I got a lot of comments on your our last discussion. One of them was a lot of people were disturbed by what they heard of Indian hospitals. So I have to ask you, do you have a story or two?
Well, there are stories after story. Every Indian hospital is a story. If I have a toothache, I want to take a flight out of that country right away because things will go wrong in that country. Just yesterday, there was a news in which in Mumbai, which is the most developed, richest city in the country, at a hospital, they used the flashlight of a cell phone to do an operation. Now, both the mom and the child died, but this is very common. G- um, I told you about this accident that happened in my dad's printing press. We were not in the printing press, so the worker who had the accident was taken away to a government hospital. And when I arrived at the hospital, the doctor told us, firstly, the guy was just lying there for a couple of hours before the doctors saw him with all his bones broken. And when I arrived, the doctor said, hey, we'll amputate his hand. There was no reason to amputate his hand, but it was just a lazy thing for the doctor to do. So we had to smuggle that person out to a private hospital. Um, my granddad died because the hospital operated on him on things that he should never have been operated on. When I was sitting in the outside the operating theater, the doctor came out saying, "I'm still thinking, working out whether I should cut this pipe to equalize the pressure or not." And I explained him to the physics that he did not have to cut the pipe to equalize the pressure. So these are the kind of stupidities you see all across the hospitals in the country. You go to an Indian hospital to die. They operate on you for things you don't need. They kill you. They keep you in ICU. They do crazy stuff. The nighttime doctors at the hospitals in India are more likely to be homeopathy or Ayurvedic doctors now, which are actually not even doctors. They are not trained in modern medicine. They are trained in quackery, but because the government probably gives them doctor as a designation, they get away with calling themselves doctor and running ICUs in hospitals. So that's how crazy and bad the whole system is, and you can do nothing about it.
Continuing our tour of the world, let's go to somewhere where you're more optimistic about, which is East Asia, which would include Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. We could include Singapore there. It's predominantly Chinese, and then of course have China in there, Hong Kong as well. I don't know if I said Japan. Now I want to ask you this specific question. There's a stereotype that East Asians, one of the things that they can't compete with the West on is innovation, right? And the stereotype, well, it's true that there's a ton of rote learning that goes on in East Asia. It's true that they're discouraged from challenging the status quo. There's a lot of stealing of patents in places like China, and a lot of sending of people to the West to kind of take Western technology ideas. And Peter Thiel, people like Peter Thiel will likes to emphasize that the West is still much more innovative than East Asia. Maybe you could unpack this stereotype of East Asians are not nearly as innovative as Westerners.
Firstly, we should is stealing of IP is no big deal. We copy each other all the time, and a lot of um, big companies came into existence even in the United States by copying technologies of other people. So I don't really blame. I'm not saying I. I'm not talking about the legalities of it, but copying is nothing unusual about it. Gabriel, copying is not easy. If you could copy and paste that easily, why would Latin America, Africa, or Indian subcontinent not be as rich as China is? Copying is a tough job. It requires a lot of discipline. It requires a lot of innovative capabilities. So, firstly, I do not look down at copying from a cultural perspective. From a legal perspective, from a moral perspective, there are maybe flaws in it, which I don't want to talk about because I don't really understand or think about much. But now, talking about being innovative and being, challenging the status quo. Um, yes, my answer is yes and no. Firstly, go and travel in these countries. Their public transportation system is truly unique. It's very different from how the Western countries run their public transportation, and it is extremely good. I can go to China, any city in China, and I can use public transportation without any problem. That is how well it is designed, and it is so cheap and so easy to buy their tickets. Um, Look at the bullet train systems in China. It's extremely good. Look at their train stations. They look like among the best airports in the world. Um, Look at how institutions in of these countries work. They are efficient and they keep themselves limited to their core need. So that is about how, there's this thing about innovation as well, that they can actually do a fairly good job of innovating and improving on copied technology. Now, there are two things which always worry me about East Asia. And those things is that there is a huge amount of peer pressure in these countries. So, students who go to schools in any of these countries face an enormous amount of peer pressure. There's a rat race. You get imbibed, inculcated with this rat race in your mind. Parents cannot protect their children from the rat race that starts going through the minds of their children, which gives them a lot of stress, and it reduces their creativity. So I completely agree with that one. Um, Rote learning is also a problem in these countries, which is again a result of this rat race. When you are in a rat race mode, you are not uh, inspired to learn from the bottom of your heart. You want to quickly copy things and you quickly want to memorize things. So there's a lot of rote learning as well. Uh, I'm reasonably sure sometimes when I talk with people in East Asia, that the foundations, the philosophical foundations that the West has, do not exist in East Asia. But these people have done an extremely good job of constructing a structure that works extremely well, which is a structure which would have been a product of this foundations of Western civilization. So East Asia has done a great, wonderful job. I hope eventually they underpin their structure with Western philosophy and Western moral values as well articulated as they are in the Western society today. Whether that will happen or not, only time will tell.
Well, one thing I'll give the South Koreans, and you can see this especially recently, there's a lot of creativity now coming out of South Korea in film, even in video games, writing. There's a good bit of creativity. I like to see that. Now, final question, East Asia giant. Now, there is a listener, probably a lot of listeners who are big skeptics on China, right? They're reading, they're listening to the mainstream views, or they're looking at what seems pretty obvious to them, that China is an authoritarian state. It imprisons dissenters. It's re-educating, possibly even genociding the Uyghurs. There's massive human rights abuses, absence of journalism, covering up of crimes against humanity. Now, if that person were willing to step back and they've listened to what you said and they say, okay, why don't I go to China myself and see what's actually going on? Just curious, what itinerary would you recommend? Like, what's the ideal trip to someone to China who has never been there before and maybe has some reservations about it?
Well, just go. Just go to the bigger cities, go to smaller cities, go to villages. And I'll tell you a story of a village I was in a few months back in China, Gabriel. This is very interesting. I was in a Muslim village in China, which has a predominant Muslim population, probably about 10,000 people, and clearly no tourist goes to that village. Um, they have a controversial mosque. The government is changing the minarets of that mosque. Um, I'm completely on the side of the government there, because you don't really want to create uh, a similar architecture to what you have in Saudi Arabia, because then people start looking up to Saudi Arabia for values. So the government is not suppressing religion in any way or form in that village, from what I know. They are doing is changing the minarets. I didn't really know about any of that, and I was this brown color, Arabic looking guy walking around the mosque without knowing what was happening in there. Um, I was not registered for that night. You are supposed to, from what I know, you are supposed to register at the police if you go to if you don't stay in a hotel. But anyway, I was walking around, and the police tried to, I'm sure there were security people, and they chased me down. The police came over where I was sitting in a restaurant for my lunch. And they were very polite, surprisingly, and they said they wanted to see my passport, and I declined to show them my passport. I said, I'm not crossing the border. I have no reason to show you my passport. Um, and I tell you, Gabriel, this was a very interesting experience. There was no authoritarianism in that guy. He did not show me his authority at all. He continued to apologize for what he was asking. He said, hey, this is my rules, and this is an order that has come from a higher authority. All I need is to see your passport to make sure I know who you are. And this is actually our rule. So, whether I agree with your rule or not, Gabriel, is a different thing. The fact remains that he was operating on the rule of law basis. He was not operating on the rule of man basis. And this is something very important to understand. Uh, he looked at my, so I just showed him the PDF copy on my cell phone. And he took a photograph of it, and he went away. He apologized again. He went away. Now, this is what China has. I don't see tyranny in that country. I go to China very often. I will be back in China next week. Um, there is a rule of law in that country. There is increasing safety in that country. And I go to China maybe 3 or 4 times a year, Gabriel, and I still have to uh, experience this thing called social credit system. I don't know what it is. It's only a question I get asked when I'm outside China. We have no-fly zone, no-fly list in Canada and the US. So maybe China has something similar, but there is nothing that I know of that I could pinpoint as social credit system. I think people should really go to China and understand how well they have done many things. Now, China is still a second world country. Do they do they do genocide of people? I have never seen anything like that. Of course, I won't see that anyway. um, I see public servants treating people very politely in that country, and I know one individual who is right now suing the government of China. This person is someone I know very closely. So you can get away with a lot in China. What is happening to you guys? I don't know how much of that is true, because most of our understanding of what is happening in Xinjiang is based on this one Vice documentary, from what I see. But at the same time, I'll tell you this thing. Muslims are probably better assimilated in China and elsewhere in East Asia than anywhere else in the world. And this might come as a shock to you, but they are extremely well assimilated. Go to Singapore and walk around in Singapore, and you will see how well Muslim women work in restaurants and retail shops as if they are fully a part of the society. You will see them jogging with Chinese. This thing is because of um, their suppression of public expression of religion. They actually enable uh, uh, erasure of religious consciousness in public space. And as a result, um, people are much better assimilated. I think Muslims are much better assimilated in China. China has done an extremely good job. I was in actually Kunming a few weeks earlier or later, when that stabbing incident happened in Yunnan, in which a Muslim guy stabbed a few people. Many people died, actually. Since then, the security system in China has improved so much that there is no inkling of Islamic fanaticism in that country. And that is why I earlier said that government, I approve of the fact that the government is changing the architecture of some of the minarets. They are not suppressing the religion, but they are changing the architecture of some of the mosques there, because they just want to make it more Chinese. They want to make you more assimilated in their societies. Now, we don't live in a perfect world. I'm a libertarian, but I see that not doing what they are doing would lead to more problems than doing what they are doing.
Moving along here on our world tour, just want to hit the Middle East very quickly. I don't think I've heard you speak about it. My first question is about the Arab Spring. Let's do the Jayant Bhandari thing where we talk about something and you kind of turn it on its head. So many say that the Arab Spring was about a rising sense of freedom as being important in the Arab world. What do you think were the motivations of the Arab Spring?
Okay, let's refer back to what I earlier said, that when the third world people look at the West and copy the good values of the West, they copy the perverse aspects of those good values. I said that when they copy Christianity, they accept voodoo. When they copy the Western civilization, they copy the hedonistic and low class aspects of the Western civilization. When they copied democracy in Egypt, and I actually wrote a long article on this much before how it played out. Democracy, when these people think about democracy, they think that it automatically leads to free stuff. It automatically leads to freedom without any constraints, which means that you can then impose tyranny on other people. Which actually doesn't really add up, because if you have the freedom to impose tyranny on other people, the other person doesn't have tyranny, but then the other person doesn't have freedom, and then the other person has the right to impose tyranny on you. Eventually, you will come to tyranny. Democratic movements in these countries are driven by superficialities rather than the essence of what democracy means in the minds of many Western people. And that is why it ended up having this perverse effect. And I think the United States government understands it very, very well, that if you impose, if they tried to convert Saudi Arabia into a democracy, or UAE into democracy, or Bahrain or Oman into democracy, things would worsen overnight. And this is what happened elsewhere in the Arab world. The moment they get democracy, as it happened in Iraq, the moment Saddam Hussein was removed, they became fanatic. So you are better off with a tyrannic with an authoritarian government in a society like that than democracy, because only the perverse aspects of democracy will be accepted by that society, because they can't see the underpinning Western philosophical values below democracy.
Before we get to Africa, let's just have a quick rapid fire session. How much more, any numbers you have would be welcome, does the West perform charity compared to the rest?
West is the only country that performs charity from what I see. East Asia is very good. Well, very, very good actually. And also the Middle East is reasonably good. The third world countries don't do any charity. They're sadistic.
One measure of a country's strength is how much they manufacture. What percent of the world's manufacturing does India do, maybe compared to another country?
India is the only country that polluted every city and the whole country. The air is toxic in that country. Indian cities are the top polluted countries in the world, but that happened even before India started to industrialize. Manufacturing as a part of GDP has consistently stayed around 10 to 13% in that country. So there's virtually no manufacturing in that country.
What are some of the highest first generation immigrant percentages in Western countries?
Canada, the United States, Australia. I have numbers of Canada, Gabriel. The first generation Canadians are about 25% of Canadian population. And the first plus second generation Canadians are over 40% of the population, which means that Canada is no longer the Canada it used to be 2 generations back.
Brief thoughts on Salman Rushdie as a writer or a person.
Well, a great writer. I've read his books. Very good writer, and this is a brave guy who wrote things that challenged the fanatics in the Middle East.
Let's move on now to Africa. And you and I are both interested in the history of Africa. I was recently reading a very useful book called The Africans by David Lamb. And Lamb is pretty frank about it. He says that Africa is not a third world country; it's becoming a fourth world country, is what he says. And if you just look at the dictators, the evil people who have destroyed various African countries, whether that's we've mentioned people like General Butt Naked, Charles Taylor, Mbate Sese Seko, Idi Amin, Robert Mugabe, Sani Abacha. You just go down the list. It's just the history of Africa is just a bloodbath. Now, they keep playing the post-colonial card, right? Now that after the Europeans left, we're disorganized, our infrastructure is crumbling. I don't know how long they can play that card, and you've kind of addressed the African mindset about that. Beyond the obvious, what are some of your recent developing thoughts on Africa, or maybe some resources you've encountered on Africa that are helping to flesh out your understanding of that continent?
I completely agree. Africa is becoming a fourth world country. And in fact, virtually all of these third world countries, with the exception of Cambodia and Vietnam and North Korea, will become fourth and fifth and sixth world countries because they are retracing their path back to what they were before European colonizers and Christian missionaries came. They are getting degraded. They are becoming increasingly savage and barbaric, the way they used to be before European colonizers came. Now, do you want to blame that on colonizers, or you want to thank the colonizers and missionaries for giving them a temporary relief for a few centuries and helping them experience some of the civilizational values? So I think from the perspective of the third world, they should be thankful that Europeans brought them some civilizational values and technology. Otherwise, these people had no technology. They had Africa. If you look at the African history, there's actually no African history because they did not really have a written language for most of the sub-Saharan Africa. They did not feel a need of that.
If I'm not mistaken, you went to jail in Zimbabwe. I wonder if you're willing to tell that story.
Oh, well, I did not go to the jail. I was walking around in Harare. And what happened in Harare was it's a nice city, easy city to walk around in. And I was taking photographs. And apparently, you are not supposed to take the photograph of the parliament of Harare. So I was taking photograph. This policeman came over and he held my hands and he wanted me to go with him to the police station because I took that photograph. Crazy, crazy stuff.
What role does a witch doctor play in the life of the average African? Feel free to share any stories you have.
Witch doctors are what you have as politicians and bureaucrats and doctors and everything. All leadership positions are occupied by psychopaths and witch doctors. Now, they might be dressed in a suit sometimes as politicians and bureaucrats, but they are all witch doctors. They are not there to help the society. They are there to exploit the people they control because might is right is the operating principle. But these witch doctors themselves are have this magical thinking, so they don't know what they are doing. They are just trying to maximize their material gains.
I guess I mean specifically the actual witch doctors, the medicine men. I'm just curious if you've ever encountered them and any of their rituals or things that people have said that they've gone to a witch doctor to do or anything like this.
Very vague understanding, Gabriel, because at the end of the day, I grew up in a family which did not believe in these things. So I did not always see these things happening. I had a neighbor, a woman, who used to get the soul of a goddess come into her every year. And she would jump around, and there's a medical term for it. There's a kind of seizure that people get which makes that happen. But Indians have a thinking, and I'm talking mostly about Indians here because I don't have witch doctor experience of Africa. But Indians think that when those seizures happen, a goddess Durga enters your body, and then people come and pray. And these are educated, well-off people who do it in our neighborhood.
Yeah, my understanding is that witch doctors play a very big role in the life of a lot of people in Africa and also other third world countries, and that they regularly go to them for advice and rituals. And you'll see very otherwise you would think rational people or people working in next to you who say that, oh yeah, a witch doctor told me that I have to perform this thing, like I have to walk counterclockwise around this building every day, or things like this. So one last quick question from one more country on our tour, going to Europe. Now, you have a amusing lecture on the southern countries of Europe, the pigs countries, right? This derogatory term for Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, countries that have debt problems, stagnant economies compared to Northern European countries. But you extrapolated that in that talk to say that there's something deeper going on, something where these Southern European countries are closer to the third world than you might think. What was your point about the pigs countries? And do you have any updated thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was a speech I gave a very long time back. The thing with the South European countries is that they are more pleasure centric than, let's say, German, Swedish, Finnish, or English are. And unfortunately, I have come to recognize, and I used to believe in pleasure centric living at one point of time, but I came to realize that pleasure centeredness does not lead to happiness. It leads to aggravation. It leads to a lot of existential crisis, because we are not made to have this non-stop feeling of pleasure in us. South European countries are quite pleasure centric, which is, and that also means that they have less moral values, because when you're pleasure centric, you compromise, you rationalize many things. You want to get free money from the government because you want to cater to your pleasure centeredness, and that's what led to the financial bankruptcy of Greece, that has led to intellectual backwardness of the pigs countries.
If you were, knowing all that you know about colonialism and third worlds, if you were in charge of the colonization of a third world country, you were the leader. You were the leader of a Western country going to colonize a third world place. What would be your plan? What would be your blueprint? What would be some of the key things that you would do?
I think the British pretty much did the right thing, which is that they were there to do business. They were there as traders, and that's what they did. Now, from today's perspective, I can judge them as being ruthless, but that's how the world operated those days. There was nothing especially bad that Europeans did, but they at the same time brought improvement in lives of those people as a consequence of what they did. So I'm pretty much in favor of, if I had to do something, I would rather follow the script of colonizers of the past than the Washington bureaucrats trying to influence countries without really understanding how those countries work.
Anything else on your mind that we didn't cover that you feel like mentioning?
Well, we have talked a lot of things, Gabriel. I run a yearly philosophy seminar in Vancouver called Capitalism and Morality, and there's a tab on my website. The next one is actually 3 weeks from now.
Excellent. Giant has contributed a lot to this show, so please go give him a follow on Twitter. Send him a nice email. Consider attending Capitalism and Morality. That's coming up here soon, um, depending on when this episode is published. Just a quick update on your book that you're working on that we mentioned in the last episode.
I am, I think, halfway through it, Gabriel, and I have to thank you for giving me encouragement on writing that book. I'm halfway through it. It takes me a long time to write. Sometimes I want to think through a lot of things, but I hope I will have the book published within a year.
Thank you so much, Jayant.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Gabriel.